Welcome to Confessing the Faith, a theological and devotional walk through the 1689 Baptist Confession of Faith. I'm your host, Sam Waldron. I'm one of the pastors of Grace Reformed Baptist Church in Owensboro, Kentucky, and president of Covenant Baptist Theological Seminary. In this talk, we come to Chapter 5 of the 1689 Confession, which is entitled, Of Divine Providence. Here's how paragraph 1 of its 7 paragraphs reads, God, the good creator of all things, in his infinite power and wisdom, doth uphold, direct, dispose, and govern all creatures and things, from the greatest even to the least, by his most wise and holy providence, to the end for which they were created, according unto his infallible foreknowledge, and the free and immutable counsel of his own will, to the praise of the glory of his wisdom, power, justice, infinite goodness, and mercy. This is the summary statement of the doctrine of God's providence. In general, everything said in this paragraph, and indeed in this chapter, is the outworking or expression of God's decree as taught in chapter 2. This is so because chapter 4 on creation and chapter 5 on God's providence are intended to tell us how God worked out his eternal decree by the works of creation and providence. The author of providence is first emphasized. It is the good creator. It is crucial that we always remember the goodness of the sovereign God of providence and never lose faith in that goodness. The foundation of providence is next stated. His infinite power and wisdom. The God of providence is not only good, but also infinitely powerful and infinitely wise. His goodness is not contradicted or arrested by anything in his providence. The essence of providence is next stated. It comes in these words, uphold, direct, dispose, and govern. Here's a simple definition of a word and concept increasingly foreign in our day. God's providence. Providence. What is providence? Well, it speaks of his complete control of history for working out his eternal purposes. The objects of providence are next mentioned. All creatures and things, from the greatest even to the least. God's providence is completely universal. Absolutely comprehensive. There are no maverick molecules, as R.C. Sproul once said. The nature of providence is not fatalistic, impersonal, or amoral. Rather, the confession says that God works out things by his most wise and holy providence. He is wise and holy in all he does in his universal providence. The compatibility of providence with his creation follows next. To the end for which they were created. God does not do crazy stuff with creation. He does not make pigs fly or fish walk on land. His providence deals with his creatures in a way that is according to the purpose for which they were created. The determining causes of God's providence are then identified. They are twofold. God's mind controls his providence, thus the confession mentions his infallible foreknowledge. God's will also controls his providence, hence the confession says, and the free and immutable counsel of his own will. This makes explicit the relation of his providence to his decree. The goal of providence is, of course, the highest goal conceivable. All is done to the praise of the glory of his attributes, including his mercy and power and so forth. No less and no other goal than the glory of God and the manifestation of his glorious attributes is conceivable or consistent with who God is. We may recognize and rest in a divine superintendence of history that controls and directs to a good end every detail of our lives, whether they feel good or whether they feel bad at the time.